to zoning and recommend a comprehensive plan change as a body, which would then set into motion the hearing process. And zoning and subdivision regulations could be amended before we amend the comprehensive plan. And there's this minor amount of vulnerability there for challenges. Is that basically
there is.
simple?
Yeah, there is. I mean, the way it's drafted in these changes, it assumes that subdivision and zoning are done first.
Zoning should be done first, and subdivision would follow, because you can't really enforce your subdivision regulations because they refer back to the authority in the zoning ordinance. They can be done concurrently, but you really can't enforce your subdivision regulations other than the procedural stuff and your checklist, for example. But any of the smaller lot sizes, the percentages of open space, the uses, you need the zoning authority in place before you can enforce that.
Okay.
Just for my 2 cents worth, rather than get into the nitty-gritty details, I think we need a bit of a philosophical discussion more first. I am concerned about the process. I strongly think we need to do the comprehensive plan first. Maybe do the others, work on the others in parallel, but I think the comprehensive plan needs to be done. I don't see that there's a big rush to get this done. There's not a lot of development pressure going on. And I think this is a major change. I would like to see a question on this in this comprehensive plan survey you're putting together in some more detail. I know we've talked about it. There were some questions kind of touching, but not specifically on this. And I think this is a big enough change. And I'd like to see the community vote on whether they want something like this or not. Right now, like you mentioned, we have the cluster development as mandatory. As you well know, I'm a big property rights person. I'm also very big on conservation, long time member of the Nature Conservancy and things like that. But I'm also a property rights person, and making these mandatory for a property developer, I have a problem no matter what size of development. But I'd like to get some feedback from the community in that survey before we make these huge changes, because I see this as a huge change. I'd like to get a feel for how many properties are left on the island that are we concerned about getting, more than a 5-lot subdivision on where these become important. I mean, I read the literature and, they're talking, when you're talking 20 or 30 homes, I see where this is a big deal. When you're talking 4 or 5 homes and you maybe going to conserve 2 acres of land, I don't see it as being such a big deal. And I don't think we got many lots left that aren't under conservation easement or something like that, where you're going to get a 20-lot subdivision or something like that. So I'd like to get a feel for that if you can put that together. And I guess there are some lots out on Beaverdale if that could happen, but I don't have a good feel for it. I'd like to get a feel for that. And, I think it should be voluntary because although, like you say, there's a lot of pressure on the conservation and there's a lot of people that think that people need to be clustered together or conserved together. There's also a lot of people out there that like their land. I'm one of them. I don't want a lot that's less than an acre. I own a 2-acre lot now, and I wouldn't go into a development that I couldn't get at least an acre of land. That's my personal preference. I know there's lots of people that don't have that, but people have a right to have that preference too, and we have to recognize that as well. So I think there's a lot of philosophical things we need to iron out. I think a question on the survey to get a better feel, a broad feel from the island residents of how they feel with a very good question on this is important.
Anybody else like to speak to the issues before we?
To the philosophical issues of it? I guess I'll start off. Do you want to? Okay. I was actually looking at this and kind of a little overwhelmed myself, but the more I read it, the more I realized it was very much in line with what we already have. except that it changes conservation to cluster. And having been on the Planning Commission in New York, where we had a lot of steep slopes, it was hell to try to preserve them. And we would get, you know, developers kind of inching us, pushing us for every single little, you know, space that they could get on a property. And I don't, you know, having looked at this, I still have some questions about it, but I just think it's terrific, frankly. I'm not sure I'm all the way to mandatory, but I'm 90% to mandatory. Certainly for, if we've already had cluster as mandatory, where we have mandatory cluster, I think it's pretty close to a no-brainer to have mandatory conservation, because it's such a much better way than cluster, where you just sprawl all over the property and then you're busy trying to argue about a steep slope or a stream that they put a road with a salt pit right next to, and instead you figure it out beforehand. That's terrific to figure it out beforehand. You know, that's kind of my broad feeling for it. So I still have questions, but along the broad philosophical point, that's where I'm at.
Can I just say, just a little before we move on, about the mandatory issue, just while it's kind of fresh in my mind, because we talked about that a lot. And
who is we?
Tony and I.
Okay.
And you're right, it is mandatory today, but I think, and I have to go back and look at exactly how it's worded, but we talked about allowing for an out, both for the Planning Commission as well as for the applicant. And the reason for that is that in the last cluster that we did, which was up on Cedar Lane, which was 9 lots, it seemed to make a whole lot of sense to do a conventional subdivision in that area. It had very high groundwater table. There were some ledge issues. It was directly adjacent to the Jamestown shores, which we are saying have 2 small lots, and the zoning is 1-acre lots. And so we developed an entire regulation saying that, you know, these lots are too small and that we need extra regulation because these lots are too small. So it just seemed somewhat hypocritical of the town to say, we now want you right next door to cluster lots on ½ an acre with well and septic system. So, you know, and so when we were going through that process, I talked to the applicant and the attorney about going with a conventional subdivision, and they weren't interested in that because it would have required a waiver on their part, which they really wanted to go through the process as being a by right subdivision, not requesting any waivers or variances. So, you know, I'm not saying that that would have been a better use of the land, but it made a lot of sense to look at that. Because they insisted on going through with the cluster, there were a lot of issues about groundwater quality. They ended up doing a whole hydrogeological study to make sure that the quality of drinking water in that area would be adequate, because, like I said, right next door in the Jamestown Shores area, they were having groundwater issues on lots of ½ acre. So, just because our soils are very poor. So I think that, you know, that I like the mandatory idea, and I like the idea of preserving land if it's a large lot, but I also like the idea of being realistic, and that that we recognize that we have a lot of environmental issues in Jamestown that may require us to go to larger lots, and that being mostly the private wells and the septic system issue outside of the village area. So,
well, can I just say,
yeah.
When you say mandatory, the way this is written, the planning board decides should it go conservation or conventional, but the applicant can come in and say, here are the reasons why I don't think it should go conservation. And he tries to convince you that a conventional plan would be preferable. There's a section here, section AC, that gives him that right. He can come in and show you 2 plans, conservation, conventional. And you weigh the pros and cons, and if you agree with them that the conventional is the better way to go, for whatever reason, then it's not mandatory. Your hands are not bound.
Well, can I
You can allow it that way.
I want to ask you about that point. He has the choice to come in and present it, but the board that's reviewing it doesn't have to grant that choice.
No.
So
You're in the driver's seat. You make the decision, but at least.
But the property owner doesn't have any choice in that.
No, he doesn't pick and choose. You do.